I'm so happy that you're here today. We're excited to be having a workshop to describe what we're doing with the ORCA Observer Reported Communications Abilities Measure that we're working on at Combined Brain with the CRACK team at Duke University. And it is really, by the way, a pleasure to work with the Duke team. It's really fun. So we also have attending this workshop representatives from several of the patient advocacy groups who are participating, and we may have them be popping up and asking or answering questions. But for right now, I would just like to introduce Christy Ziegler and Leslie Zapata Leyva, which I probably pronounced your last name wrong, Leslie. And so I'll start with Christy. If you can introduce yourself. And you know what? I forgot to introduce myself. This is Terry Jo Bichelle. I am the director of Combined Brain. I'm a neuroscientist. I am specialized in biomarkers and outcome measures, as is Combined Brain, which is the consortium for outcome measures and biomarkers for neurodevelopmental disorders. And we represent 35 different neurodevelopmental disorders, all trying to fast track clinical trials. And with that, I would like to introduce Christy, and then you can introduce Leslie, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I just wanted to say it's such a pleasure to work with you all as well. And we're really happy to be here today to talk with everybody about our project and a little bit about what we do and why health measurement is so important. So I'm Christy Ziegler. I'm an assistant professor at Duke. I'm one of the core faculty members in the Center for Health Measurement. So my training was in research methods, so the study of research with a focus on statistics as well as psychometrics, which is the study of testing and measurement. So all of the work that I do right now is developing and evaluating outcome measures, as well as using outcome measures from a patient and family-centered perspective. And I focus specifically on rare diseases and pediatrics. So Leslie, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I'm Leslie. I'm a clinical research specialist at the Center of Health Measurement with Christy. And I've been here for a little over a year now, officially. And yeah, it's been a delight being a part of this group and working on this project.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about the project and what is it? What's it all about?
Yeah, I hope it's okay to share my screen. I have some slides. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, what we do at this, who we are at the Center for Health Measurement, what we do, and why outcome measures are so important and why we focus on those. Then I was hoping to get a little bit into the development of the ORCA measure, sort of where did it come from, what is its story, and what we're working on right now with the FDA-funded project. Then Leslie's going to talk a little bit about what families can expect from participation, and then we will wrap it up with, questions, answers, as well as talking about like what's our end goal for this project, if that sounds all right. Perfect. All right, before we jump in, I have some disclosures. So it's important to note that our study team has developed the ORCA measure, and if it's commercially successful in the future, we may benefit financially along with Duke University. I'm also going to be talking about an FDA-funded study as part of this talk today. So there's some details about that grant award right there on the slide. It also is really important to note that any views expressed by me or Leslie are our own and don't necessarily represent our funders or our employer. So let's jump right in. So what is the Center for Health Measurement? So we sit within Duke University in the School of Medicine within the Department of Population Health Sciences. Right now, I think our count is at 11 different faculty members, 10 staff members, and 2 postdoctoral trainees. And really what we're focused on doing is centering patients and caregivers to improve their care, their quality of life. And so we really do that in 4 big domains. The first is really to identify outcomes that matter, right? So what should we be researching? What should we be focused on? You know, what should therapeutics be targeting, right? Like what matter to people who experience different aspects of their health? So stakeholders could include patients, parents, caregivers, but also sometimes we engage with providers, so clinicians, payers, and regulators. The second area that is most relevant to this project is developing and evaluating clinical outcome assessments. And so clinical outcome assessments, or COAs, is just a fancy word for survey tools. So we're going to talk a little bit more about like what this looks like, what's this typical process, and why it's important. We also have a group of folks that look specifically at preferences for patients and caregivers. This is really aligned with like decision-making processes. So in the clinical trial setting, you can think about this as them, they're trying to figure out how people make decisions about taking medicines, or when do benefits outweigh risks or side effects of a certain medication. And then we also focus on researching the research. So what are the methods that we use to do all these things? How can we do it better? How can we do it more efficiently? How can we do it in a way that really does bring that patient and family voice into the center of research and clinical care? So that's really the value, I think, of what brought us all together at the Center for Health Measurement, is really this idea of how do we bring people's voices into care planning, treatment decisions, the health policy that really impacts their day-to-day life, right? So the way that we do this is through this measurement model. And I'm going to give you an example within the clinical trial setting, because that's really what the project that we're talking about today focuses on. So in a clinical trial, right, especially with this newer paradigm of patient-focused drug development, we typically have a medication. We know something about the safety of this medication, but our question is, does it work? Is it working in the setting the way that we expect it to? So traditionally, how we do that is we take this medication, we give it to a large group of people, and we monitor their health status. Now, when we're evaluating if this measure or if this medication is working or not, we're really interested in one of three things: how the person is feeling, how they're functioning, so can they go out and live their life in the way that they would like to, and how they're surviving. Now, survival, as you can, as if you're thinking about it, it's a little bit more objective, right? It's pretty clear from, from their medical chart if somebody is living longer or not. But if we're interested in how somebody is feeling or how they're functioning, right? Feeling is something like symptoms, pain, fatigue. This is something happening inside somebody's body. Functioning is something that's happening in their life, right? That happens most of the time outside of the clinic setting. We really need to talk to the person or their family, their caregivers, to really get an idea of, has their life improved? Has their health improved within this setting with this drug or this medication? And so the way that we do this in a standardized way is we use a clinical outcome assessment or a survey tool to get standardized information from patients and their families about how they're feeling or they're functioning. Now, within a clinical trial, we're making pretty high stakes decisions, right? Does this medication work? Does it not work? How well is it working? And so the way that we're getting this information about how a person is doing really depends a lot on how we ask this question and what questions we're asking. So our work is really focused in on this clinical outcome assessment or a COA or the survey to really identify if it's high quality. Now, what does high quality mean when we're talking about a clinical outcome assessment? We want it to be meaningful. It needs to matter to people, it needs to matter to their families, it needs to matter to these other stakeholders. And if it's not meaningful, the danger or the risk that we run into is that we end up with drugs that do something, but it's not the something that people want to happen in their lives, right? It's not the thing that's going to really impact and improve their quality of life. We also want our measurement to be valid. This means that we're measuring what we want to measure. So if we say we're measuring fatigue, we're measuring fatigue. We say we're measuring communication, we're actually measuring communication. This also means that we're measuring the important components of that thing. So for communication, for example, this means that we're measuring all of the important pieces of communication from the perspective of the people that are being impacted by the clinical trial. We also want the measure to be reliable. So we want to get consistent, stable information. We also want it to be sensitive. So we want to make sure that if a change is happening, so we give a medication, person gets better, we want to make sure that the scores show that. Now, if we end up with a measure that's not valid, reliable, or sensitive, the danger there is, I would say probably the worst case scenario is we have drugs that work, but we're not able to show that they work within a clinical trial, right? So we end up with clinical trials that fail, not because the medication isn't doing what we think it's supposed to do, but because we weren't able to show that with the measurement tools. So that is why I think the focus around outcome assessments, outcome development, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of focus there, especially in a clinical trial, right? Because any outcome assessment endpoint model goes in with the drug, proposal to the FDA. So there has to be buy-in from all sorts of stakeholders, right? Like pharma cares about measurement, the FDA cares about measurement, the patients and the families care about measurement. So we want to make sure that we're doing this the right way. So how do we know if a clinical outcome assessment or a survey is of high quality? So I'm going to use the observer reported communication ability, or the ORCA measure, in our current project to give an example. I wanted to pause there, see if there are any questions on the initial piece.
Does anybody have any questions about that? I do. Can you go back to the slide that had valid, reliable? Okay. Yeah. So when you're talking about a COA, which I think we should probably keep using the words for that instead of the acronym. So a clinical outcomes assessment, which for the most part is usually a survey. So when you're talking about a survey and you're saying, is it meaningful? You actually want to know if the questions you're asking are something that people want to tell you. Isn't that what that means exactly?
Oh, yes. So you can think about it at the broad topic level, like should we even be measuring this thing like fatigue or communication, but also in the way that we ask the questions, right? Like, are these the components of communication that matter to your family, that represent your experience? So it's sort of like broadly, are we measuring what we should be measuring, but also are we measuring it in a way that's meaningful and resonates with families?
Okay, so now I'm going to skip valid for a second and go to reliable. So just to restate that, when you're saying, is it reliable? You mean if you ask me about my son's abilities today and you ask me again in 2 months, that I'm going to still give you pretty much the same answers? Or do you mean that if you ask me and then you ask my husband, if both of us are going to answer the same way? What do you mean?
Yeah, so reliable, I think, means both things. So we want to make sure we're getting consistent information, we're getting stable information. So you can think about that in terms of people, right? So is it reliable when we talk to you? Is it reliable when we talk to your husband? Are we getting generally the same answers? And we can also think about it over time. So if we ask you in the morning and we ask you in the afternoon, but your son's communication hasn't changed significantly, we would want to see scores that are really similar. Now, I think over time, we're usually in the data, we're usually looking to see closer scores, closer responses if it's the same respondent. But obviously you and your husband have slightly different perspectives of your son. You interact with him in different ways. So we might see some differences. We don't want to see really large differences, right? We want consistent, stable information over people, over occasions.
Okay, so now I want to still ask more questions, but I want to go to sensitive. Okay, so, and then I'm going to take valid last. So for sensitive, you're saying if something changes, and that would be for better or for worse, can the survey pick up the change? So let's say that my son, he doesn't have words per se. He does have verbal approximations, but he does have a bunch of signs and he communicates in all different ways. what if I felt like there was something new that he did that I thought was kind of a big deal? Like maybe maybe when he was hungry for lunch, he got a plate and brought it over to me. And I felt like that was communicating that he was hungry for lunch.
Yep.
So what you're saying is that will this survey be sensitive enough to pick up a change in something that I think is important and meaningful in my life, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's exactly right. And I think when we talk about how do we do that, right? How do we know that how are we ensuring or supporting the fact that any measure is going to pick up on those things that are meaningful changes, both improving but also worsening, right? We ground that in actually talking to caregivers, right? Because I don't know necessarily what's meaningful to you, and you don't know what would be meaningful to me. So we have to talk to people to really pick up on what are those things that are meaningful, and how do we ask about them in a way that's going to pick up on those maybe subtle changes that are really important.
So for one family, that might not be a meaningful change, but for another family, that might be a meaningful change. So you're trying to figure out what are the exact gradations and what is a meaningful change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we've seen is depending on where your child's current level of functioning is, what is meaningful improvement might look a little different, right? Depending on where you fall on the spectrum. So I think any measure that's sensitive has got to show or include different ways for meaningful improvement, especially in communication. It has to have different areas where you could see growth.
So if a child, for example, really had a hard time moving and maybe, couldn't use signs or assistive devices, but was able to look at something that he really wanted in a consistent way, would that be something that you could try to pick up with the ORCA, or is that going to be kind of too hard to notice that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we part of our qualitative work in Angelman syndrome, which I have some slides on in just a minute, there's the modality or how somebody is communicating mattered a lot. So the ORCA was designed to include those different ways somebody communicates, whether that's through sounds, through eye gaze, through moving their body, going to get something and bringing it to the parent, and also devices, whether they're high tech or low tech, like a picture book or a talker or something like that. So we wanted to make sure we were not focusing just on verbal speech, like some of the existing measures really do, that we were broadening the way that we think about communication and how individuals communicate so that we can get at those important behaviors. Yeah.
So, okay, so now I want to get at the valid question.
Okay, great.
Okay, so whenever we talk about the ORCA, we say we're trying to validate it in a whole bunch of different disorders, that it was started for Angelman syndrome, but now we're trying to validate it. So you explained valid a second ago, but I just want you to break it down into a smaller piece. What does that mean?
Yes. So at a minimum, or a broad umbrella term, validity means, or valid means that we're measuring what we intend to measure. So when we say we're measuring communication, we actually are measuring communication. Now, there also are different ways that we support the idea of something being valid. So we gather a lot of evidence, and the way that we do that is through multiple different research methods. So we do qualitative work, so that's interviews with caregivers to help us define what communication ability is, what it looks like, what are the important components. We do testing of a measure, where we sit down with parents and we give them a draft measure and we say, like, hey, how is this working? What questions do you have? Is your experience reflected in these questions? Like, what should we change? So that all helps us to build this supporting evidence for a measure to the validity of a measure. We also gather quantitative data. So we give the measure to a relatively large group of parents and then do some statistical tests on it to also help us to support the validity of a measure or not. So I think validity to me is probably the biggest bucket term, and reliability and sensitivity could perhaps fall underneath the bucket of validity, right? But at a minimum, are we measuring what we want to measure?
So if it weren't valid, if it was not a valid survey, then you might, what does that mean? It's not valid.
Yeah. Well, I think the danger is that you don't see changes that are really happening because you're not asking the right questions. And so an example of that in communication, we want to measure communication. So we pull a measure off the shelf and it's asking us about vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, right? So we ask these questions, it's communication, right? But it's not, the content of the measure isn't matching the experience of how people are communicating. So if we don't see any changes in that way that we're measuring communication, but your son is going to get the plate and bringing it to you and he's hungry, right? That's a major mismatch in content. So we're not actually measuring the full picture of communication ability if we're just asking those subset of questions. So I think validity is it, right? We need to have support for validity to use a measure. And if we're thinking about content, is the content right? Then the way that we have to establish if the content's right is to talk to parents and see what that concept means to them and how does it show up in their life? What do they notice? What's important? What new skills has their child gained that really did help? You know, like they can request what their favorite food for breakfast, right? And that improves that interaction. So I think validity to me is the thing that we're trying to get at. And if we're missing the mark on validity, we really run the risk of not being able to trust scores that we get from the measure.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else have any questions, or should we let Christy keep going with the next part of the presentation? Okay, Christy, unless somebody pops something. Oh, I do have a question. Can you address the challenges? Jayetta, do you want to go ahead and turn your camera on and ask that question?
No, you can just read it.
Okay. She says, can you address the challenges of identifying measures that are meaningful, valid, reliable, and sensitive, which can also be observed in the limited time of a trial?
Yes. So this, it sounds like a question about maybe the limit. So I think there's two things that this question brings to mind. Number one is administrative burden. So how long does it take to give these measures to people? How long does it take to gather the information within a clinical trial? And that's something that we're always thinking about, especially if we're developing a new measure like the ORCA, where we're intending for it to be used in clinical trials. We're thinking about how it's administered, how long it takes, you know, how often we should be giving it to parents, right? I think the second question, or the second thing that your question brings up, is also, how do we do all of this validation work when these clinical trials are coming down the pipeline a lot quicker than, you know, maybe we would like 5 years to do all this fancy measurement deep dive, right? But a clinical trial is coming next year, or in 6 months, or in 2 months. So how do we use something that's reasonable enough that we're confident that it's going to pick up on changes if they exist? I think those are two different questions, but those are absolutely considerations when we're developing or we're pulling a measure off the shelf, right?
Okay, thanks.
Christy, if I could just clarify, I think it's more, the point of my question was more about, for severely affected kids, how much can meaningfully change in that limited time period? So you're working on communications, but all these other things. I mean, my grandson's been working on head control for 9 years, and he makes meaningful improvement, but what could be measured, you know, in a 10, 16-week period that would really reliably capture progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the answer to that is it depends, and it depends on the concept that you're measuring and the therapeutic or the anticipated mechanism of action of the drug. So how is the drug supposed to work, and what changes are we expecting to see within that window, right? And it really depends on, so a measure that picks up on broad changes really reliably might not be a good measure to plug into a clinical trial that's only 10 or 12 weeks, right? Where you're looking at, you need to see improvements. That might be you might need something much more sensitive, much more gradient for that 10 to 12 weeks, so you can pick up on those emerging skills, right? So I think it really depends on how you're using the measure and what time frame you're focused on. That helps you pick what's a high quality measure, and it might look different depending on the clinical trial, right?
And I guess also what we should say is the ORCA may not be the measure that every single person can use at every age and every severity level. That it may be that after the ORCA studies are done, we know that it's meaningful, valid, reliable, and sensitive in a certain subpopulation of kids who have certain abilities. And so that may be one of the things we decide during all this study period. Okay, should we go to the next? And thanks, and do put your questions in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So the next section of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the development. So where did we come from? And then talk a little bit more about the FDA funded study. So the story of the ORCA really starts with the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics, or FAST. So they came to the Center for Health Measurement. They were looking ahead at the pipeline, seeing all these exciting potential therapeutics coming through, and they realized that they needed a way to measure communication ability. And so the context of use is what it's called, but it's basically what do you want to measure and how you want to measure it was really specific. So they were looking at individuals with Angelman syndrome from 2 years old through adulthood. They wanted a broad range of communication behaviors, so across expressive, receptive, and social communication. We knew we wanted it to be any measure to be for our clinical trial. So we wanted a set of items that were going to give us a quantitative or a numerical score. We wanted to be able to identify changes pre or post treatment. We also were expecting broad changes. So the therapeutics or the medications that this was really targeted for, this measure, was for therapeutics that were going to change or fix the genetic issue in the brain. So there would be capacity building and then subsequent skill building. So we didn't need communication ability to happen, changes in that to happen right away, but within a larger follow-up window is what we were thinking of. Now there's a lot of text on this slide, but I just wanted to point out two major limitations. So we went to the literature, we looked at what was out there to measure communication ability for kids with Angelman syndrome. And there were a number of limitations that really justified use of a new measure. The first was that parents and caregivers were not involved in the questionnaire design. So that qualitative, the interview portion of the support was missing. And for a lot of the measures, the individuals with Angelman syndrome would score at the floor, especially those that were developed as screening tools for typically developing children. They would score at the floor, which means you couldn't really tell differences if it changed, right? There was not a lot of gradiency. There was not a lot of ways to see those subtle movements. So what we used was the typical approach for developing outcome assessments. This follows the FDA 2009 guidance, as well as other established and published guidances out there and how to develop high quality clinical outcome assessments. So what we did is we started with talking to people. We sat down with caregivers, as well as some clinicians who worked with these patients. And we talked to them about communication. What does typical communication look like? What are the behaviors that you notice? What really matters to you? We took all of this rich, detailed information and we built a conceptual framework. So this is just mapping out what communication ability looks like to from the perspective of caregivers. We take that framework and then we use it to develop our survey questions. This goes through multiple rounds of review. We had parents and relatives of individuals with Angelman syndrome meeting with us regularly on the study team to check in to make sure it was making sense. When we had the measure in a pretty good format, we went ahead and we tested it. So we sat down with parents again. We gave them the measure and we said, you know, how is this working for you? Do you understand it? Do you have questions? Is your experience captured within it? We also did a translatability review. So we gave it to a translation company and asked them to assess how well it could be translated if we wanted to do that in the future. And then after we had updated and modified the measure a number of different times, we gave that version to a larger group of folks to get some quantitative or numerical data about responses that we could perform analysis on. Now, I'm not going to give you too much of the results from Angelman syndrome, but I did want to show you this. So this is one of our first draft conceptual frameworks. So this is based on interviews with 22 caregivers, 6 speech and language pathologists. And the major takeaway that we got from this was that communication is really complex, right? There was a lot going on here that was being missed by existing measures. There are a lot of things that almost every child did in some way, like requesting or seeking attention. But there were other things that were less frequent, but still really meaningful, right? So telling stories, asking questions, or responding to complex directions. We also, like we had talked about before, we heard about modality. So how somebody communicated really mattered. And we heard things like sounds, signs and gestures, using assistive technology, whether high tech or low tech, as well as eye gaze and use of the body. All of those things really mattered. So we needed to integrate those into how we asked about communication and not just rely on verbal speech. So at the end of that formative work, we ended up with the first version of the ORCA measure, assessing a broad range of communication concepts. We really calibrated it to the ability levels that we saw. So the content matched all the data that we gathered, supported that the content, so what we were asking about, really matched what parents' experiences were communicating with their child. We set it up so that the parent or the caregiver could complete it independently. So we were using their direct responses without anybody else, helping out. And it was relatively quick to complete. Now, when we were at that stage of the project, we had a lot of interest in the ORCA measure from within the Angelman syndrome community, but also outside of the Angelman syndrome community. So a lot of these limitations that existed in existing measures were also affecting the measurement of communication ability for other neurodevelopmental disorders. And a lot of the groups that were contacting us were really also focused on this clinical trial space. So how do we measure communication within these clinical trials? So we started thinking about how do we scale up? How do we create efficiencies across different diagnoses and different populations? So that's when we applied to this FDA funding program, which was focused specifically on COA, or clinical outcome assessment development. We were so lucky to partner with Combined Brain in this project. So the ultimate objective of this study is to really promote patient-centered clinical trials by focusing on the measure of communication ability, using the original version of the ORCA measure as a guide. So this is a phased award. We have a 2-year planning phase and a 3-year implementation phase. So the full project will be 5 years. The first aim is a qualitative aim. So we're looking specifically to identify the core concepts and levels of communication across the 12 neurodevelopmental disorders that are part of this project. So we're interviewing caregivers basically for aim 1. Lots of caregivers. We're talking to folks about how they communicate with their child. What do they see? What's important to them? The second aim that's listed here is basically just us synthesizing the information, deciding what we need to do in that next 3-year phase of the project. This figure just shows the data sources. So on the left in blue, we're doing qualitative interviews with caregivers. We're also collecting any data that's out there on communication measures. And then we're using that to identify where the gaps are in the measure. Where do we need to add questions? Where do we need to modify? This figure shows the organizational chart. And so this shows you all the different stakeholders that are involved. So I would say patient advocates, parents, caregivers are our primary stakeholder for this project, right? We want a measure that really speaks to the family's experience and is meaningful for them. We also have a number of clinical experts, obviously the health measurement team. We also have an external technical advisory committee that has folks from industry, the FDA, patient advocates, all involved. So this is a heavy communication style project where we're getting feedback on every level of the project, including how we're doing the interviews, what does the data mean, and what do we need to do next. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Leslie to talk a little bit more about AIM-1 and what do the qualitative interviews look like and what can the parents expect from the qualitative interviews.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. You can go ahead, Chrissy. Okay, before the caregivers ever get to the actual interview process, they first have to go through this screening process. And that's essentially to determine if they're eligible or not to be a part of the study. The entire screening process, if they're eligible, is around 20 minutes. So first we just schedule a screen call with the caregiver and we complete the screening to determine their eligibility. The eligibility criteria is pre-approved by the research team and also the stakeholder group. So they get together and they determine the eligibility criteria together. In order to complete the screening, we remind the caregivers to have a copy of their child's genetic report and have reliable cell signal and internet connection. During that process, while asking those questions, if for whatever reason they're deemed ineligible, we thank them for their time and stop the screening there. If they are eligible, we get their verbal consent and demographic information, get things like their address to send them the ORCA survey, and schedule the interview. Go ahead. Now the actual interview is around 60 minutes and it's mostly comprised of two parts. The first part is the concept elicitation portion, which I will explain more of what that is in the next slide. And then the second part is the actual completion of the ORCA survey that they should have received in the mail beforehand and questions, follow-up questions about the survey. So the concept elicitation portion, concept elicitation is essentially a conversation where the interviewer asks open-ended questions to understand what concepts are important to them, like Christy has been mentioning. And so during this part of the interview, we're asking them questions like what typical communication looks like for them and their child, what are their child's communication strengths, open-ended questions like that. This is an example of an interview that was conducted earlier for this project. And the caregiver was talking about how their child's communication, how they communicate their needs. And especially it tends to happen around food. And listening to the caregiver talk about what typical communication looks like for them, the interviewer also picked up on the modalities of communication that their child uses. And in this case, it's gestures. The interviewer also talks about other possible modalities of communication that the child may use, like sounds, words, or word approximations. According to the caregiver's response, we then learned that the child uses some sounds and word approximations to communicate. This is just one example. Like I said, we also ask a variety of other follow-up questions to learn more about their communication with their child and also what is meaningful for them. go ahead. And then after this, we transition over to actually complete. So we give the caregivers some time to complete the survey. After they're done, we ask them some follow-up questions about their overall experience. So this includes things like what was irrelevant, what was missing, what was confusing or hard to understand, and also specific probes about specific items on the ORCA survey that we're wondering whether or not they're relevant for that group. And this is another example where we ask those follow-up questions, and the interviewer is asking if they consider one of the modalities included in the survey as their child's primary mode of communication. And they answer that yes, they do. It's gestures and signs. And then the interviewer follows up and asks why. And then we learn that they consider it their primary mode of communication because it's the one that they use most frequently. We also ask caregivers about, like I said, anything they found difficult, hard to understand about the survey. We ask them about the recall period. So is a 30-day time period appropriate for them? And like I mentioned at the beginning, for the most part, this whole process takes around an hour to complete. However, caregivers love to talk about their kids. So sometimes it may go over, but we make sure to check in at the 1 hour point and be respectful of their time. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leslie. All right, so I just have 2 slides left, and then we can pause for questions and discussion. That sounds good? Okay. So where are we currently within the FDA-funded study? So we are within the 2-year planning phase. We have a lot of qualitative interviews to do with caregivers. The way that we've set up that 2-year planning phase is we're rolling out our interviews in cohorts. So each cohort consists of 3 different neurodevelopmental disorders. We have a study startup period with each patient advocacy organization where we work with them on how should we recruit caregivers, what questions should we ask, who is eligible, who should not be eligible. And so right now we have finished cohort 1. They are in data analysis, and we should be reporting and talking about some data by the end of the summer. So we're really excited about that. We are currently enrolling in cohort 2. I would say we're probably halfway, maybe a little more than halfway for cohort 2, and cohort 3 is on deck. So we're working with those groups. We're going to start working in June more intensely about their specific protocols, as well as our qualitative team will listen to a presentation from them to talk about their experience caring for children with each of these neurodevelopmental disorders. So what is the end goal of this project? What we're hoping at the end that we will have a family-centered measure of communication ability with documented support for use across multiple neurodevelopmental disorders. We're hoping that this measure is high quality, will be accessible, meaning it's out there for people to use within their natural history studies and their clinical trials. And we're hoping that ultimately the content will be meaningful to multiple stakeholders and centered in the family's perspective. So finally, just to wrap up, this is a picture of our Duke team. We have, multiple different layers of expertise in here: qualitative, quantitative, communication, all of the things. And then these are some of our partners and our collaborators. And I also want to take every occasion to express my gratitude to all of the families and caregivers and relatives who participate both within the study, on the study team, in the stakeholder engagement group meetings that we have, but also the families that participate in the interviews and donate their time to this. We're so appreciative, and we're hoping our entire goal is to do you right and make sure that we have a measure that really speaks to your experiences and meaningful to you. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing now so that I can see folks' faces if people unmute and we can have some questions.
So thank you so much. It's really great to hear the whole presentation all at once. I have a question I want to ask, and then I want to open it up to other people. So at the end of the 5-year process, will this survey only be considered valid in the 12 disorders plus Angelman syndrome, or will it be considered valid and usable across a lot of neurodevelopmental disorders?
Yes, that again is a great question. So I'll speak. I have 2 points that I want to talk about. So traditionally in measure development, it's been done in silos, right? Where we focus on Angelman syndrome, we gather all this evidence, we have a measure for Angelman syndrome, then we maybe move to the next one and then the next one, right? One of the benefits to doing it all at once is that one of our goals is to create efficiencies in this process, right? So what is the information that we need to know about a rare disease to make a determination if the ORCA is going to be useful or not, right? What are those questions that we need to ask parents and families? So the hope is that we'll create efficiencies and we'll have a ton of data from the 12 different disorders who are part of this. And we're hoping that all of that will make it easier for other folks to determine if the ORCA is going to be meaningful and valid and reliable for them. So I think ultimately our goal is broader than the 12 groups. Now, I think one of the key pieces, right, is if a measure is going to be used within a clinical trial, you need buy-in from all the stakeholders, including the FDA or the regulatory folks that are involved, right? And I think that's one of the things that made this specific grant opportunity really exciting for our team, right? Because I cannot speak for the FDA, but on our side, the grant is set up where we have, this interaction with the FDA at multiple parts of the project on a regular basis, so that we are more likely at the end to have buy-in from the FDA, right? Because we're able to integrate their feedback throughout the process. And so that was really what attracted us to this opportunity.
And what kind of feedback do you think the FDA has had? I mean, what are the concerns that the FDA has about making a survey like this? What does the FDA care about?
Ooh, that's a good question. Now, I'll say again that I cannot speak for the FDA and their priorities, but I will say that one of the things that we've talked a lot about is the goals for the qualitative work, and what type of questions do we need to be asking parents to make sure that the content is matching their experiences. We're able to pick up on differences between neurodevelopmental disorders and how individuals are communicating. And we're thinking about meaningful change, right? So what does that change look like? Whether an individual is getting better, which we're hoping within a clinical trial, but also for diseases that are more progressive, is meaningful changing mean that they are stopping loss of skills, right? They're keeping all the skills that they have now. And so I think on our end, my impression is the content is high priority for us, as well as a lot of the discussions we've been having, as well as that meaningful change. So what would change look like? How do we conceptualize that? That's my impression.
I do want you all to put questions in the chat, but if you don't, I'm going to keep asking. Leslie, what I want to know is, you've been interviewing the different disorders. How different are they between each other? Are you having a lot of surprises?
I think it's a little too early to tell, but so far in just my individual interviews, because I know Nicole's on the call and she's done interviews too. And we have another colleague who also does interviews. They have been very different. They have been personally from caregivers that have children that are very nonverbal to children that speak multiple languages and full sentences. So I think it varies a lot for my personal experience from group to group.
So there's another question. Jayetta asked a good questions, and her question is, Why does the FDA seem to value differentiation across a disorder which may or may not be significant?
So again, I cannot speak for the FDA, but what I can say is I think one of the questions that we hope to answer with the qualitative work and why we're doing 8 to 12 interviews within each neurodevelopmental disorder is so that we can speak to heterogeneity or differences both within a group across caregivers, but also between different groups, right? Are there differences, or are there core set of communication components that are relevant to everyone? And I think one of the things that we're finding that Leslie just spoke to is that there's a lot of variability in how individuals are communicating and what level they're communicating at. But we are seeing a core set of components that are coming up across groups, right? So the way that the ORCA measure is currently set up, we have things like refusal, right? Saying no to something. But there's a lot of different ways somebody can say no. They might cry or fuss if they don't want something. They might push it away. They might look away. They might throw it across the room, right? Or they might say no, or they might shake their head no, or they might have a symbol or a gesture that says no. So that heterogeneity and how is the person communicating, that feels like really important to have on the measure. Also within these larger concepts that are resonating across different families, right? And so it does, at this point, again, it's still really early because we have not finished analysis for our first cohort, which has 3 neurodevelopmental disorders, and we're currently in interviews for the second cohort, but it does feel like there are core sets of components that we should be measuring, and our job is to really get at the different examples of how individuals are communicating for that purpose and making sure that matches with the content on the ORCA. So I would suspect, this is just my impression again, that moving forward, if we have similar clinical presentations, the underlying genetic mechanism is not what's really going to matter to the measurement itself, and does it match with your parents and your families. It's really about how somebody is communicating and what that, it's more downstream, I think, than the more physiologic changes that we might see with a genetic treatment. Communication is more an aspect of function.
So we only have time for one more question, so it's going to be mine. And that is the question I get a lot about this project, which is, it's just a survey. Why don't you just send out the survey and see what people say, and then you analyze it, and then you're done? Why aren't we just sending out the ORCA that you already wrote for Angelman syndrome, or developed and already tested in Angelman syndrome? Why aren't we just using that? Why do we have to go through this big, long, involved process?
Yeah, well, I think the hope is not everyone will have to go through this big, involved process, but what we're trying to answer right now is all related to that validity component, right? And the only way to know if the content of the measure, so the questions that are on it, are really getting at what we want to measure and really resonating for families, is talking to people. That's the only way we can do that. And right now, in a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorders, what typical communication looks like from the perspective of the caregiver is not established. So I think as parents, and you see other families, and you really know what communication looks like. As researchers, clinicians, and clinical trialists and the FDA, we don't know what's happening in your homes. So to know that the measure, and to really document, right? Like we have to have it written to share with our stakeholders, to really know that the measure is hitting the right place in communication ability. We have to hear from parents about what communication looks like. And so that in the FDA guidance that was published in 2009, that like aspect of content validity, and in other published guidances, quantitative or numerical evidence can support validity, but to really actually evaluate content validity, you need that qualitative work. So you need the interviews with caregivers. So
you have to actually ask people what they think.
You have to, yeah, we have to ask people, what is typical communication like for your child?
And what their life is like, what their kid is like.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here's the very last. So we still have 30 seconds left. So the very last thing is, could you, we're always talking about measures that our kids are below the floor. Will you also, will it be possible to graduate from the ORCA? So for example, if you're a child who gets better and is able to learn to read and write and spell, then will the ORCA no longer be the right measure for you? Will will you now need to use a more standard school-based measure after that?
Yeah, I think so. So this is one of the questions that we're hoping to start to answer in the planning phase based off the information that we're getting from interviews, but is also something that we're going to have to tackle in the second phase of this project is, what is that upper bound, right? When do people graduate, and how can we link scores so that we know what it means, and we can track people as they increase their communication ability. And there are existing measures, right, that do a really good job of evaluating typical communication development in a way that's, we have a lot of normative data, a lot of reference data, we know how to interpret it, right? There's measures that do that really well. So I think one of the goals that I'm hoping to do with the more numeric data that we'll get in the next phase is really see how we can do that. How can we link measures, and how can we keep track of folks if they're jumping from this one to that one? Yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, but I would just really like everyone to turn their cameras on for a second, just so we can see everyone, and if you can. And I'd really like to just thank all the combined brain groups who have been a part of this. And I would like to thank all the people who work for Combined Brain who have been a part of this. And then above all, I would really like to thank the Duke team and everything that you're doing. Thank you.